There are people who move through life unable to grasp why no one truly surrenders to them. They offer everything, speak the right words, fulfill every social expectation, yet still face an invisible barrier. Meanwhile, they watch others who seemingly without effort awaken profound devotion, unwavering commitment, surrender that defies logic. The difference doesn't lie in physical appearance, material wealth, or perfect discourse. The difference exists in dimensions that ordinary consciousness cannot perceive, in territories of the human soul where ancestral forces operate. There exists a secret alphabet that the psyche recognizes instantly, a hidden syntax that deactivates resistance and opens pathways to the deepest chambers of human connection. Most people live their entire existence without discovering this code, endlessly repeating behavioral patterns that repel rather than attract, that create distance instead of intimacy. They wonder why their relationships remain superficial, why others keep their walls raised, why genuine reciprocity never materializes. The answer lies not in what they do, but in what they fail to activate within the invisible architecture of the human unconscious. When you comprehend these psychological mechanisms, when you learn to communicate directly with the layers beneath conscious awareness, something fundamental shifts. The entire dynamic transforms. The person before you begins lowering their defenses not through rational decision, but through instinctive recognition. They start revealing what they typically conceal, surrendering in ways they cannot consciously understand or explain to themselves. This isn't manipulation. This is resonance. This is speaking the language that the conscious mind doesn't control, but the unconscious comprehends perfectly. Carl Jung spent decades mapping these invisible territories. He understood that true surrender doesn't happen at the surface level of personality, politeness, or social performance. It occurs when you touch something primordial within another person, when you activate dormant forces that have been sleeping in their psyche since before memory, since before language, since the dawn of human consciousness itself. These forces don't respond to clever words or strategic behavior. They respond to authenticity that vibrates at frequencies the ego cannot manufacture. Consider how you've experienced this yourself. Remember the times when someone's presence affected you in ways you couldn't explain. Not because they said impressive things or performed grand gestures, but because something in their energy, their essence, their way of being touched something ancient within you. That's what we're exploring here. That's the power we're learning to understand and embody. The people who inspire total surrender aren't necessarily the most attractive, the wealthiest, or the most socially skilled. They're the ones who've learned to operate from psychological depths that others ignore. They've discovered how to activate archetypal patterns, how to hold space for shadow without judgment, how to maintain presence that paradoxically includes absence. They understand that surrender isn't given to perfection. It's given to totality. It's given to someone who embodies the very thing the other person's soul has been unconsciously seeking. Are you ready to discover what actually generates profound surrender? Not tactics or techniques, but transformative understanding of how the human psyche recognizes its counterpart, its mirror, its completion. Because once you see these 5 hidden secrets, once you understand the invisible mechanisms that create irresistible psychological gravity, you'll never approach human connection the same way again. The question isn't whether these secrets work. The question is whether you're prepared to embody the depth they require. Jung grasped something that superficial psychology consistently overlooks. Authentic surrender doesn't occur at the conscious level. It happens when you touch someone's unconscious, when you activate something ancestral that dwells dormant in their psyche, waiting for the right frequency to awaken it. What we label surrender is actually the moment when someone discovers in you a reflection of their totality, a mirror of what they've been searching for, without knowing they were searching at all. Think about Sarah. She spent years pursuing deep connection, meeting people who articulated the correct phrases, who behaved according to established social standards. But something crucial was missing, until she encountered someone who didn't attempt to impress her, who refused to follow the expected script. This person did something radically different. They allowed Sarah to see her own depths reflected back. They didn't chase her. They recognized her. And in that recognition, something within Sarah opened completely, like a flower that had been waiting for the right light. Surrender cannot be forced. It can only be invoked. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But for that transformation to occur, you must comprehend the invisible mechanisms operating beneath the surface of conscious attraction. Most people approach connection from the outside, trying to present the right image, say the right things, create the right impression. They remain trapped in the realm of persona, of masks, of performance. The majority believes that surrender is earned through perfection, compliance, strategic behavior. This is precisely backwards. Profound surrender emerges when you activate dormant archetypes, when you awaken the integrated shadow, when you allow the other person to find in you what their soul seeks unconsciously. This isn't manipulation in the conventional sense. It's psychological resonance. It's speaking the dialect that the ego doesn't control, but the unconscious understands fluently. When someone surrenders completely, it's never because they made a rational decision. It's because something within their interior recognized something within yours. A frequency, a truth, a wholeness that their psyche had been longing for without possessing words to name it. The conscious mind creates 100 reasons to explain the attraction, but those are merely stories constructed after the fact. The real event happened in dimensions the conscious mind cannot access directly. Jung discovered that every human being carries within them an internal map, a psychological blueprint of what they seek in others. This map isn't created by media or culture, though those forces certainly influence its expression. This map is archetypal, ancient, connected to patterns that have repeated throughout human history. The hero and the maiden, the sage and the seeker, the warrior and the healer. These aren't just stories. They're psychological realities that live within us, seeking expression and completion. The person who understands this operates from a completely different paradigm. They're not trying to become what the other person wants consciously. They're attempting to embody what the other person needs unconsciously. They're learning to activate the psychological patterns that create irresistible pull, not through deception, but through authentic expression of archetypal energies that resonate with the other's hidden depths. This is why some people seem to effortlessly attract devotion, while others, despite doing everything right, encounter only superficial connection. The difference lies in depth, in willingness to operate from layers of self that most people keep permanently hidden, in courage to activate forces within the other person that they themselves may not know exist. The 5 secrets we're about to explore aren't tricks. They're doorways into this deeper dimension of human connection, where surrender happens naturally because it's recognized as the soul's homecoming. The first hidden secret operates through what Jung understood as psychological tension, the paradox of conscious absence within presence. Consider Marcus, who remained perpetually available, responding to texts within seconds, canceling his own plans to accommodate Lisa's schedule. Lisa appreciated his attention but never surrendered to him. Then she met Daniel, who would disappear for days without explanation, who maintained zones of mystery, who clearly had a life that didn't revolve around her availability. Lisa found herself thinking about Daniel constantly, investing emotional energy, surrendering in ways she never had with Marcus. Why? Because Daniel activated something crucial in her psyche: creative tension. Jung knew that opposites generate psychological energy. Total availability creates passivity in the other. Conscious absence creates active desire. The second secret involves witnessing the shadow without recoiling. Consider Maya, who concealed her intensity, her contained rage, her darker desires from every previous partner. She showed only her social mask, the acceptable version. But when she met someone who said, "I see your fire and it doesn't frighten me," something collapsed within her defensive structure. This person didn't merely accept her light, they acknowledged her darkness. And in that acknowledgement, Maya found permission to exist in totality. Profound surrender happens when someone sees what we hide and doesn't flee. When they look directly at our shadow and name it without fear or judgment. The third secret is strategic indifference toward the ego's performance. Gabriel tried to impress every woman he encountered. He spoke about achievements, displayed social value, constructed an impressive image, but one woman asked him something devastating. All of that is fine, but who are you when nobody's watching? That question destroyed his mask and forced him to present himself without filters. Paradoxically, she surrendered not to Gabriel the successful, but to Gabriel the vulnerable, who emerged afterward. People surrender when you stop feeding their ego and start challenging their authenticity. The fourth secret involves mirroring their unconscious archetype. Jennifer consciously sought stable, predictable men, but her animus, her internal masculine, yearned for the wild and untamed. When she met someone who embodied that archetypal energy she had been repressing, Jennifer surrendered in ways she never imagined possible. Not because this man was objectively better, but because he activated something ancestral within her psyche. Deep surrender occurs when you embody the archetype the other needs to integrate for their own wholeness. The fifth and most powerful secret is this: surrender to your own individuation process. You cannot invoke wholeness in another if you live fragmented. You cannot ask someone to drop their masks if you remain hidden behind yours. You cannot activate deep archetypes if you deny your own. This is the secret that integrates all others, the foundation without which the other four become manipulative techniques rather than authentic expressions of psychological depth. These secrets function not as strategies to apply, but as states of being to embody. The presence within absence isn't a game of strategic disappearance. It's the capacity to maintain your center, your rich internal life, your purposes, regardless of the relationship's status. And that genuine autonomy, not performed but real, is what the other's unconscious perceives and responds to with surrender. Seeing shadow without judgment works only if you've done the work of integrating your own shadow. If you've looked at your own dark aspects. If you've stopped projecting onto others what you deny in yourself. Because then, you're not viewing the other's shadow from moral superiority, but from compassionate recognition. And that energy, that authenticity, cannot be falsified. Why do these secrets function at unconscious levels? Because they touch the very structure of how the psyche seeks completion. Jung discovered that every person lives with a sensation of internal fragmentation. A division between what they show and what they hide. Between ego and shadow. Between conscious and unconscious. Total surrender occurs when someone perceives in another the possibility of integration, of wholeness, of becoming complete. The paradox of conscious absence operates on the principle of psychological tension. The unconscious activates in response to the incomplete, to mystery, to what it cannot fully control. When you're always available, when you're completely predictable, the other's unconscious goes dormant. There's nothing to resolve, nothing to explore, nothing to psychologically conquer. But when you introduce spaces of conscious absence, when you maintain zones of your interior that remain inaccessible, you activate the unconscious's search mechanism. The person begins projecting, imagining, investing psychic energy in deciphering your totality. Witnessing shadow without recoiling touches something even deeper, the longing to be recognized in totality. Every person lives with aspects of themselves they consider unacceptable, parts they repress and conceal. Jung called this the personal shadow. When you encounter someone who not only tolerates your shadow but recognizes it as a legitimate part of your wholeness, something fundamental unlocks. That person becomes witness to your complete truth, and the unconscious interprets this as profound safety. Surrender occurs because finally there's someone before whom you can exist without masks, without pretense, without fear of rejection for your totality. Strategic indifference toward the ego destroys conscious defenses. The ego lives constructing narratives about who we are, protecting the image we present to the world. When someone doesn't validate that image, when they remain indifferent to your social mask, the ego enters crisis, and in that crisis, the true self can emerge. The person who provokes this crisis becomes powerful because they refuse to play the expected social game. They operate from a deeper level of authenticity that the ego cannot manipulate or control. Mirroring unconscious archetypes is perhaps the most potent mechanism. Jung discovered that we carry within us ancestral images, universal patterns seeking expression. The anima in men, the animus in women, the archetypes of the hero, the sage, the mother, the warrior. When you embody the archetype that the other's unconscious yearns to integrate, you become a catalyst for their individuation. And the unconscious responds to that with total surrender, because it recognizes in you a missing piece of its wholeness. But here's what most people miss. These mechanisms don't work as isolated techniques. They work as integrated expression of someone who has done their own psychological work. The person who can hold space for another's shadow is someone who has confronted their own darkness. The person who can mirror archetypes is someone who has made their own archetypal world conscious. The person who can maintain presence within absence is someone who has cultivated a rich internal life that doesn't depend on external validation. This is why surrender cannot be manufactured through technique alone. It requires genuine psychological depth. It requires that you've traveled into your own unconscious, faced your own shadow, integrated your own fragmented parts. Only then can you serve as a genuine mirror for another's journey toward wholeness. Only then does your presence carry the weight, the gravity, the psychological frequency that the other's unconscious recognizes as authentic. The people who inspire deep surrender aren't playing games. They're living from depths that most people never access. They've done the difficult work of becoming whole themselves, and that wholeness is what others recognize and surrender to. Not to perfection, but to authenticity. Not to performance, but to presence. Not to ego, but to self. But understand this clearly. Wielding these secrets without consciousness can unleash forces beyond your control. Because when someone surrenders completely, they're not merely giving you their love or time. They're surrendering their shadow, their unconscious, their deepest projections. And if you lack the integrity to hold that surrender, the result is psychological devastation for both parties. Look at what happened to Nathan. He discovered the power of presence within absence and began using it with Claire. She started surrendering progressively more, seeking his validation constantly, organizing her life around his appearances and disappearances. Nathan felt powerful initially, but he failed to comprehend that he was activating Claire's psychological dependency, not her wholeness. When she finally collapsed emotionally, he found himself with someone who had lost her center, her autonomy, her integrated shadow. In that moment, Nathan realized he had created a dynamic he couldn't sustain. Surrender had transformed into bondage, and both became trapped. The same happens when you witness another's shadow but weaponize it. Imagine Rachel, who recognized Thomas's dark aspects, his abandonment fears, his repressed rage. Initially, that recognition created profound intimacy. Thomas surrendered completely, but Rachel began using that knowledge as a weapon, activating his wounds whenever she needed control. What had been a mirror became an instrument of harm, and Thomas, who had lowered all his defenses, found himself exposed and vulnerable in ways that destroyed his capacity for trust. Indifference toward the ego can transform into psychological cruelty, if not accompanied by genuine recognition. Some people use this indifference solely to destabilize, to create constant insecurity in the other. Yes, that can generate a form of surrender, but it's the surrender of trauma, not love. It's the dependency of the abused with their abuser, where the person surrenders not because they find wholeness, but because they've lost their capacity to exist autonomously. Jung warned about the danger of activating archetypes without consciousness. When you embody the archetype the other needs, but do so unconsciously, You become a vessel for projections you cannot sustain. The person surrenders not to who you actually are, but to the archetypal image they project onto you. And when that projection inevitably shatters, surrender transforms into hatred, into devastating disillusionment. You've promised without words something you cannot deliver. This is why the fifth secret is the most crucial. Surrender to your own individuation. Without that foundation, the other four secrets become tools of unconscious harm. You'll activate forces in others without possessing the depth to hold them. You'll create surrender that's really dependency. You'll mirror archetypes you haven't integrated in yourself, setting up inevitable collapse. The ethical dimension here cannot be ignored. These secrets give you access to profound psychological mechanisms in others. That access comes with responsibility. The question isn't just, can I make someone surrender? But, am I developed enough to hold that surrender with integrity? Because genuine surrender is sacred. It's someone opening their entire psychological landscape to you, trusting you with their wholeness and their wounds, their light and their shadow. If you use these secrets from ego, seeking power or validation, you'll create damage. If you use them from self, from your own integrated wholeness, they become invitations to mutual transformation. The difference is everything. One path leads to psychological manipulation and eventual destruction. The other leads to genuine connection, where both people become more whole through the encounter. So before you attempt to invoke surrender in another, ask yourself, have I surrendered to my own process of becoming whole? Have I faced my own shadow? Have I integrated my own archetypes? Have I developed the psychological capacity to hold another's totality without collapsing or inflating? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're prerequisites for ethical use of profound psychological knowledge. So, we arrive at the deepest truth, the integration that makes all five secrets not just powerful, but transformative. Genuine surrender only emerges when you yourself have surrendered to your own individuation process. You cannot invoke wholeness in another while living fragmented. You cannot request that someone lower their masks while you hide behind yours. You cannot activate profound archetypes while denying your own. The final paradox is that these secrets function not as techniques to apply, but as states of being to embody. Presence within absence isn't strategic disappearance. It's the capacity to maintain your center, your rich internal existence, your purposes, independent of the relationship status. And that authentic autonomy, not performed but genuine, is what the other's unconscious perceives and responds to with surrender. Witnessing shadow without judgment works only when you've integrated your own darkness, when you've looked at your own unacceptable aspects, when you've stopped projecting onto others what you refuse in yourself. Because then you're not viewing the other's shadow from superiority, but from compassionate recognition. And that energy, that authenticity, cannot be manufactured. Indifference to the other's ego emerges from transcending your own ego. When you no longer need external validation, when your worth doesn't depend on impressing anyone, then you can invite the other into that same space of freedom. It's not calculated coldness. It's presence from wholeness. And mirroring archetypes functions when you've made your own archetypal world conscious, when you've explored the universal images living within your interior and given them space for expression. Only then can you hold the other's archetypal projection without losing yourself in it, without inflating or collapsing under its intensity. Do you see now why genuine surrender is mutual? It's not something you make happen to someone. It's something that emerges when two people meet on the path toward their wholeness, when both are willing to see and be seen, to recognize and be recognized, to hold the other's shadow while integrating their own. The question, therefore, isn't, how do I make someone surrender to me? The question is, am I surrendered to the process of becoming who I truly am? Because when you live from that surrender to yourself, from that pursuit of your own totality, something shifts in your presence. You become magnetic not through strategy, but through authenticity. People surrender not to your techniques, but to the truth you embody. Jung expressed it in a way we cannot improve. The meeting with oneself is one of the most unpleasant meetings, but it is the beginning of everything. When you have the courage to encounter yourself in totality, with your lights and shadows, with your masks and your essence, then yes, you can invite another to that same journey. And that invitation is irresistible to the soul that's ready. Deep surrender isn't begged for, isn't manipulated, isn't forced, it's recognized. Like two souls who finally find in the other a mirror of their search for wholeness. Are you willing to become that mirror? Or are you still waiting for someone else to make first the journey that only you can initiate? The 5 secrets we've explored aren't separate techniques. They're facets of a single, transformative truth. Wholeness recognizes wholeness. When you become integrated, when you live from your totality rather than your fragments, when you embody the depth you've discovered within yourself, you naturally invoke that same depth in others. Not through manipulation, but through resonance. Not through strategy, but through being. That's the ultimate secret. Surrender cannot be taken. It can only be met. Soul to soul, depth to depth, wholeness to wholeness.